We got breaking news on Capitol Hill tonight. Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz has officially filed a motion to force a vote to oust Kevin McCarthy from the speakership.
I have enough Republicans where at this point next week, one of two things will happen. Kevin McCarthy won't be the Speaker of the House, or he'll be the Speaker of the House working at the pleasure of the Democrats. And I'm at peace with either result because the American people deserve to know who governs them.
Gaetz making this move after months of high tension, but says the last straw was McCarthy working with House Democrats to avert a government shutdown over the weekend. The vote to oust McCarthy could happen in the next 2 days. Gaetz admits he might not have the votes the first time around, but he is willing to force many votes to get what he wants. McCarthy responded with 3 very important words. Bring it on. Well, somehow I do not think he is talking about the 2000 cinematic masterpiece, even though Matt Gaetz responded with just did. Back with us tonight, David Plouffe, former Obama campaign manager and senior advisor to the president, and MSNBC senior political analyst Matthew Dowd. He is also a former George W. Bush strategist and founder of Country Over Party. David, to you first, where do we go from here?
Well, Stephanie, who really knows? But I think at the end of the day, McCarthy probably survives this. If he doesn't, so if you're an American or a Democratic member of the House, the question is, what comes after could be a lot worse. And is it really a job worth having? The leash will get shorter and shorter. The promises to the Gaetzes of the world will get crazier and crazier. So it's an absolute mess. And I think McCarthy, who, generally has been a spineless figure in Washington, for one show to spine, and we'll see how this turns out. But at the end of the day, I think as troublesome as McCarthy's reign has been, and we should all be concerned about it, if you think about who would replace him, that will be even worse. Of course, what's fascinating is, the Republicans, and I think they're overly optimistic, but I think their sense is, maybe they're holding a pretty good political hand. And it's this type of circus, Trump's trials, Gaetz, that gives, I think, swing voters pause. Do we really want to give these people more power than they currently have?
But is what's happening right now giving Matt Gaetz exactly what he wants, Mr. Dowd? He loves a show, and now he's got one.
Well, I think that he represents actually what most of the Republicans are all about, which is performance art. That's really what fundamentally their stake in Washington is. None of them, or hardly any of them, really want to govern. Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't want to govern. Lauren Boebert doesn't seem to want to govern. Nancy Mace doesn't seem to want to govern. Elise Stefanik doesn't seem to want to govern. They're all in this, I'm going to tweet something out or go on Fox News and say some crazy stuff. And so, I think this is, we've come to the point in time, and I think this is Speaker, McCarthy's fault. He created this Faustian bargain that he has, where he basically let the animals in the zoo out of their cages. And now he's wondering why there's bears coming to the zookeeper trying to tear his arms and legs off of him. It's his fault. He allowed this circus to sort of go untended to. And now he's suffering the bulk of the repercussions of it, as well as worse for our country is suffering the repercussions of his inability to lead.
So Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene, who believe as long as they have the mic, as long as they have the headlines, they're winning. Is that really the case? Because, David, former Speaker Newt Gingrich, who's not a George Bush Republican, he is still a Republican daddy who has a lot of say and power, is actually asking if Gaetz is secretly a Democratic agent. And he said no one is doing more damage to the House GOP than Gaetz. What do you think of that?
Well, it's fascinating, Stephanie, right, coming from Newt Gingrich, who is kind of the original, or at least modern, bomb thrower, and sort of take no prisons and demonize the other party, demonize your opponents. So for him to say that, again, I think gets to the sense that, listen, I think there's very few Republicans, but even Donald Trump, as crazy as he was today, seems to be making some nods to the fact that he understands for the first time he has to try and grow his 46%. which is all he's gotten both times, basically up to 48. I think Newt Gingrich understands that the House Republican majority could not be more precarious. And in those swing districts in New York State, in California, and other swing states, this kind of behavior is anathema to swing voters. So I think it's fascinating. Newt would not be the first person you'd think to stand up, given his history of saying that. So that tells you, I think, how, people who've been through this before and understand how precarious that House majority is and how close the Senate's going to be, how close the White House race is going to be, that you don't have much margin for error. And again, if you're a swing voter in, the suburbs in Maricopa County in Arizona, in Waukesha, Wisconsin, outside of Atlanta in Georgia, you got a lot of problems. You got a lot of things you want Washington to deal with. This kind of behavior is certainly not one of them.
Okay, well, besides all of that, I mean, David, you're saying Donald Trump even realizes he needs to expand his base. I want to share just a little bit of the rhetoric he has been pushing on the campaign trail, which, honest to God, sounds like the crazy train because it's more unhinged than ever. Just watch this. It's just a tiny bit of what he's been saying.
Together we will take on the ultra-left-wing liars, losers, creeps, perverts, and freaks who are devouring the future of this state like a swarm of locusts. And we'll stand up to crazy Nancy Pelosi, who ruined San Francisco. How's her husband doing, by the way? Anybody know? I will direct a completely overhauled DOJ to investigate every radical DA and AG in America for their illegal, racist, and reverse enforcement of the law. We will immediately stop all of the pillaging and theft. Very simply, if you rob a store, you can fully expect to be shot as you are leaving that store. Shot. They say that there's so much water up north that I want to have the overflow areas go into your forests and dampen your forests, because if you dampen your forests, you're not going to have these forest fires. So I have a choice of electrocution or shock. You know what I'm going to take? Electrocution. I will take electrocution every single time. Do we agree? If somebody's beating you by 10, 15, or 20 points like we're doing with crooked Joe Biden, let's indict the motherfucker. Let's indict him.
We can laugh at sort of the absurdity and the stupidity, Matthew, but this is also darker and more violent than we have ever heard. And it's like we've become numb to it. But don't we have to talk about what he's doing and what he's saying? I mean, even how's Nancy's husband doing? He was beaten by someone who is attempting a home invasion in the middle of the night.
I have so many things to say about what we just saw, because, first of all, the idea that there's been column inches dedicated to Joe Biden as whether his capacity to lead, and watching that as a testament to somebody's mental acuity in the course of this is, I mean, and I agree. I think we should talk about it more. I think we spend way too much time on the fitness of, quote unquote, the fitness of Joe Biden, and we watch a guy that just stands up and says that. That's first of all. Second of all, for him to talk about perverts, creeps, and liars. I mean, this guy is under indictment and has credible evidence of being a pervert, of being a liar, and of being a creep. That's what's so fascinating to me. And third, to take this to its natural end with the conversation we just had about Newt Gingrich, I'll be less diplomatic than I think David was in the course of this. This Donald Trump and Matt Gaetz is the natural culmination of what Fox News and Newt Gingrich did in the 90s. They are the natural culmination. They are the ones that introduced zero-sum politics. They're the ones that introduced division out of the country. They're the ones that made the attacks on democratic norms in society. And for people like Newt Gingrich, who I haven't seen criticize Donald Trump and his bizarre, crazy behavior in the course of this, to criticize someone like Matt Gaetz, Newt Gingrich dumped toxins in the lake of America, and he's now complaining about a three-eyed fish like Matt Gaetz. It's ludicrous.